Hi, I'm Brenna. I am a crime prevention specialist with the Menomonie Police Department.
Hi, I'm Kelly. I'm a patrol lieutenant with the Menomonie Police Department.
I'm Kat. I am the sexual assault victim advocate and campus advocate at the Bridge to Hope.
And I'm Angie. I'm the Director of Sexual Assault Victim Services at the Bridge to Hope. Well, as you know, May is Mental Health Awareness Month. Everyone has mental health, whether that's mental health concerns, mental health wellness, or somewhere in between. Mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we can handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. Mental health is important at every stage of life, from childhood and adolescence through adulthood. One's ability to maintain their mental health can be changed by experiencing chronic stress, anxiety, fear, shame, and sadness that comes with domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking.
It's important to understand the prevalence of mental illness and mental health disorders, both on a local level and then also on a larger scale when we're talking about this. So in looking at some numbers provided by the NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, 1 in 5 US adults experience mental illness every year. 1 in 20 experience serious mental illness every year. 1 in 6 youth, 6 to 17, experience a mental health disorder every year. 50% of all lifetime mental illness begins by age 14 and 75% by age 24, which is a pretty huge number. And suicide is the second leading cause of death among people age 10 to 34, which is, again, pretty substantial. Looking on a more local scale, and these numbers are from 2020, so bear in mind that might have, with the pandemic, a little bit of an impact, either way. But officers from the Menomonie Police Department responded to a total of 145 classified mental health related calls and 77 welfare checks, which sometimes, not always, can be linked to a mental call as well. And then a total of 28 Chapter 51s occurred throughout the year, which we will discuss what that means in a minute here.
The Menomonie Police Department, we respond to a lot of mental health issues where our officers are responsible for going to different calls. Sometimes they're called in by family, sometimes they're called in by friends, sometimes they're called in by the individual that's experiencing the crisis. We respond with more than one officer usually when we don't know what's going on. Our goal is to try to help this person get the help that they need to deal with whatever mental health crisis they're dealing with. Mental health not only affects the people on the street that we talk to, but it also affects the officers who are dealing with some of these more sensitive crimes or more serious in nature crimes. Officers oftentimes see the effects that some of our more violent crimes have on a family or on the people that are experiencing it. They also are affected by seeing that stuff. Our officers are all sent to CIT training. CIT training is a training where we are taught different ways to help deal with people in mental health crises, different ways to talk to them so we don't escalate the situation unintentionally, and different ways to get them to seek help that they want and that they need to get them into a place where that they're feeling the way they want to feel at that time. We almost always call and contact Northwest Connections when we've determined that it is a mental health crisis to refer to their training and their experience about what they think the best course of action is to take, and if they would like to send somebody out to actually talk to the person in crisis, or if they'd like to do a phone conference with them.
Okay. And we've gotten questions about what Northwest Connections is. Northwest Connections provides emergency mental health services to contracted counties, Dunn County being one. In these situations, when officers confer with them, they'll do an assessment of the person to work to find a resolution that meets the needs of the person where they're at in the least restrictive manner possible. In doing it this way, it's a more community-based approach. So the goal is to have the person actively participating in their own treatment and their own plan, rather than them being forced into something which may make it worse, the situation worse. So, for example, a least restrictive outcome could be passing on information to, human services or another entity for following up, providing the person with resources, allowing the person to remain at home independently or independently with like a planned phone check-in, creating a more community-based plan with a support person, so somebody in that family or a friend as well, to stay with the person or check in with them. Voluntary admission to a crisis bed or a voluntary admission to an inpatient facility. The last option that they'll help us determine is if an emergency detention is necessary, which would be an involuntary admission to a facility.
When you start going into the emergency detention, that's under Chapter 51 in the state of Wisconsin state statutes. A Chapter 51 proceeding refers to Chapter 51 of the Wisconsin statutes state Alcohol, Drug Abuse, Developmental Disabilities, and Mental Health Act. The legislature enacted this law to assure that the provision of a full range of treatment and rehabilitative services are available in the state for all mental disorders and developmental disabilities, and for mental illness, alcoholism, and drug abuse. Individuals who are in crisis have been evaluated and found to be in need of emergency detention under Chapter 51 are taken to a mental health institution for the treatment. This is done so against their will, and it's considered the least restrictive method because it is taking away their right to make those decisions. If they're considered for Chapter 51, the person has to be either mentally ill, drug dependent, or developmentally disabled, or there's a substantial probability of physical harm to him or herself or others, and it's evident by the recent acts or omissions, attempts or threats, or the individual is a proper subject for treatment. We begin our Chapter 51 by taking them to an emergency room where they evaluated. They have to be medically cleared. We work with Northwest Connections then to try to find a proper facility that will take them and then accept them if that is the chosen route to go. These Chapter 51 situations from start to finish can last anywhere from 6 to 12 hours before we are able to even transport the individual to where they go. And a hospital can deny access to the individual for whatever reasons. We may end up taking a 4-hour drive to the south end of the state to take someone on a Chapter 51 hold if need be. We currently have a behavioral health officer that was just given to us. One of our officers is taking that over, and some of the primary focuses he's going to be working with is mental well-being. At the police department, we have put a very strong focus on our officers' mental health and our officers' mental well-being as well. Due to the nature of a lot of the calls we see, we find it's very important to encourage our officers to be physically, mentally, emotionally taken care of. We've been working to start a peer mentorship program because of that, to give officers the opportunity to talk to someone if they go on a particular call that officer finds to be very upsetting to them. In the past, that wasn't necessarily the case. Officers were just expected to deal with these complaints and calls on their own. Now we are making it a situation where it's okay to talk about things that are bothersome, because officers are people. We have families, we have our own situations, and we are also dealing with these situations with some of these people. Sometimes on more than one instance where we're going through, we see the progression of what's happening in their situation. And sometimes it can wear on an officer's mental well-being too. So we encourage officers to talk and to take care of their mental health and to seek someone to talk to, even if it's not one of our own officers, but to make sure that they're aware of things that are bothersome to them and to seek the proper help when needed. So if we have a particularly stressful event or something that's pretty traumatic for officers to see, the officers involved will be mandated to take, we meet as a group for a debriefing. The group purpose of that is we talk about things to look for. If you are struggling with, maybe you don't even realize that you're struggling, but things that maybe your behavior has changed. like you're sleeping less or you're having nightmares, you continually relive the situation. Maybe your eating has changed. We encourage healthy means to deal with it, such as exercise, eating healthy, drinking enough water, getting enough sleep, and to avoid things such as alcohol, or to avoid things such as letting your diet slide and you start eating all fast food all the time, or something that is not making you feel physically well. So we meet as a group and talk about that. And if we want to talk through the case, we will do that. Ours is offered through our EAP, our Employee Assistance Program. We've also done debriefs where we've included EMS and the firefighters at some of the calls. Some of it helps to be able to talk to, if it's a death, for instance, the medical examiner may join, talk through what happened after they did their portion of the call, because everybody has a role. And sometimes it creates more mental distress, not knowing what the outcome of the situation was. Also, it's something to include our dispatchers. They are answering phone calls and they're dealing with the same stress and the same knowledge of some of the things that are going on, but they don't get to see it till the end. They don't know what the outcome was, but they maybe dealt with something very traumatic on the phone or heard something very traumatic on the phone. So we try to talk about it as a group. As a supervisor, knowing your people and knowing when something is off with them, it's important to take notice and address that with them and talk to them and make sure that they are aware they have options to seek our EAP on their own as well, to talk to someone at the department, to talk to somebody outside the department. But we try to make sure that we are debriefing and talking through these cases so officers can kind of process it better.
I just want to say thank you for sharing how the officers process some of this traumatic events, because advocates, much like officers, we experience that same secondary trauma or vicarious trauma that officers sometimes face, just at a different level. Advocates typically hear so many stories in a day and see things that we may not be ready for or don't have advance notice for, such as, sometimes videos, pictures, those types of things. And so we do a lot of the same things for our mental health for our staff as well. We do a lot of debriefings. We have regular meetings 3 times a week to sit as a staff to discuss certain cases, how they're affecting us, if we need to set certain boundaries for ourselves. That's super, super important when you're working in mental health at all, to have boundaries, not only with your clients, but also just like what you're viewing on social media. The people that you're talking to, like the content of the things that you're talking about. If you leave work and you're consistently watching horror movies or listening to podcasts about, sexual violence, it's probably not going to be as good for your mental health. So we really try to watch the things outside of work as well, but we really utilize each other. We debrief after each meeting. We have closed door sessions where we can just vent to each other. We also, much like the officers at the police department, we do have an EAP that we can utilize, which offers some therapy sessions and things like that. But one of the things that we really prioritize in our work is self-care. When somebody is even hired at the bridge, that's what we talk to them about. Like, even if you don't have personal experience with domestic violence or sexual assault, you probably know somebody that has. And so listening to some of these stories and working with folks that have experienced this can really trigger you, and you may not even be aware of it. So we talk about that right at the hiring process. Like, you might feel these things, and if so, please reach out, because you don't know until you know. So we really encourage really good self-care, good boundaries. We really rely on each other. And then one of the coolest things that we just kind of developed is through a group that I'm part of called Menomonie Cares. There's some really awesome individuals in there. And I was talking about the struggle it is for people working in mental health and working in crisis and not having the support that we need sometimes. So some awesome people in there talked to some folks at Stout, and we're going to be part of a pilot program for staff support that we actually get to start tomorrow. So I'm really excited about that, because A lot of people forget about the caregivers and that they also need that support as well. So I really appreciate that the police department is also looking out for their folks, because we know how much you guys witness and have to go through. So it's really important that you're getting that help too. And aside from just like the staff's mental health, there's a huge link between mental health and trauma survivors. Research consistently shows strong associations between sexual violence victimization, domestic violence victimization, and poor mental health, including anxiety, depression, and PTSD. On average, more than half of the women seen in mental health settings are being or have been abused by an intimate partner in their lifetime. There are specific diagnoses that are commonly experienced by folks, including post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety. Traumatic events produce profound and lasting changes in physiological arousal, emotion, cognition, and memory changes that wouldn't necessarily result in a diagnosis necessarily. So it's really important to understand that someone's mental health can be impacted without necessarily having PTSD, depression, or anxiety. Whether or not someone develops PTSD as a result of their violence depends on a lot of different factors. So we don't want people to just think that because you've experienced trauma that you for sure have PTSD. Like, you have to be diagnosed from a professional. So by no means do we want to give that impression. But there are many ways in which a victim or survivor's mental health can be impacted. It could include difficulties with being productive at work, having difficulties at school, difficulties like if you're a caregiver, caring for your children or your loved ones, establishing and engaging in healthy relationships and adapting to change and coping with adversity. A victim or survivor's mental health can be weaponized and used as another form of violence and harm, including someone gaslighting you, making you think that you're going crazy because your mental health is suffering. Mental health coercion is a commonly used tactic that's targeted towards the victim or survivor's mental health as part of a broader pattern of abuse and control. Other common tactics that target mental health include that emotional abuse, especially gaslighting.
Another piece of this whole mental health puzzle, particularly for survivors of trauma, is this sense of a loss of agency. Agency being the feeling of being in charge of your life, knowing where you stand, what you have to say matters, knowing that you have a say in what happens to you, knowing that you have some ability to shape your own circumstances that you're living in. And trauma, that experience can really shut down a victim or survivor's inner compass and often takes away that feeling of self-worth and self-confidence, and can take that pieces of imagination that they need to create something better and to heal from the trauma that they've experienced. Not being able to figure out what is going on in their lives and in their bodies causes survivors to often feel like they're out of touch with their needs, and it makes it really difficult for survivors to properly identify how to take care of themselves and make that happen. Failure to be in touch with your body, not surprisingly, contributes to lack of self-protection, high rates of re-victimization, and also it can make it really difficult to feel pleasure, sensuality, and like I said, to have some sense of meaning in life, and to feel secure in who you are as a person.
So like we were saying earlier, everyone has experienced something upsetting and hurtful. However, there are times when these experiences are just more than upsetting and possibly harmful. There's a difference between events that are temporarily distressing and those that are traumatic. Trauma is any event that a person perceives as harmful or threatening and has a long lasting effect on a person's well-being. So that could, outside of just like domestic violence, sexual assault, you can also think of things like man-made disasters, tornadoes, earthquakes, generational trauma and historical oppressions, school bullying, violence in the schools. There are all kinds of things that can cause a trauma, a particularly nasty divorce or a death of a loved one, or, a major car accident. So the folks that we work with, not only have they experienced some sort of violence, but they may have other traumas stacked on top of that as well. So according to the National Center for PTSD, about 60% of men and 50% of women have experienced a traumatic event at some point in their life. And I honestly feel like it's much higher than that even. So like I said earlier, when we were talking about PTSD, it has to be a diagnosed thing. So in order to receive a diagnosis of PTSD, an individual must experience the following symptoms for at least 1 month. So it could be re-experiencing the trauma event as if it were happening again in the present moment, which is called a flashback. So kind of like vivid nightmares are also re-experiencing that trauma. You could be experiencing avoidance, such as staying away from the place or event that reminds you of the person or the place of the trauma. Hyperarousal, such as having difficulty sleeping or being jumpy or startled very easily, or thinking and mood problems, such as memory difficulties or loss of interest in activities. And there are many more too that you can add to that. But you have to go to a doctor and really get talk and figure these things out. I never want someone to just self-diagnose. That's not helpful, and you want to get the treatment that you deserve and need.
Right. So it's, given everything that we've talked about here, it's really evident that there are a lot of links between experiencing trauma and having all these different mental health symptoms, whatever they might be. And that looks different between each individual. According to the World Health Organization, women who reported partner violence at least once in their lifetime are nearly 3 times as likely to have suicidal thoughts and 4 times as likely to attempt suicide. And unfortunately, we often don't see these symptoms, or they're not, they're not presenting outward all the time. A lot of people internalize those things and keep them to themselves. So you may not even know that people are experiencing these things or going through these things. And that's why it's really important for us to, at least for me, like those numbers really speak to me, and hearing just how prevalent that is makes it much more obvious that this is what people are going through, and this is what's really going on. Another thing I want to note here is that psychiatric symptoms and also substance abuse and misuse can really impair somebody's judgment and thought processes, which would include their memory, and that makes it difficult for people to make safe and informed decisions and make proper plans for themselves. Experiencing any kind of mental health or substance use disorder puts people at a greater risk for being controlled by an abusive partner, unfortunately. That's a huge vulnerability, and unfortunately, manipulators and abusers do often take advantage of people in that position. So it's important that we are cognizant of that and talking about it. And also, there's that stigma. I think everybody knows there's a lot of stigma around substance use and also around mental illness. So that stigma contributes to the effectiveness of abuse tactics, and it can create a lot of barriers for survivors when they attempt to seek help, if they ever attempt to seek help, because like I said, those barriers make it really difficult for anybody to even come forward in the first place.
I think from our end as well, that a lot of the times when we see people struggling with some kind of substance abuse issue, there's a lot of underlying trauma that they've experienced previous in their life. And it's a very common thing that we see when we're trying to help people get where they need to go.
I would agree. I think here too, when we're working with survivors, oftentimes there's a huge intersectionality between someone experiencing violence, but also having really low self-esteem, low self-worth, having some real mental health anxieties, and also quite often dealing with substance abuse as well. So it's really important that when we're working with survivors, that we're using a person-centered approach and really utilizing that trauma-informed care so that we can understand and recognize and respond to all these types of trauma. Using that trauma-informed care framework, it focuses on physical, psychological, and emotional safety and the healing for every person that we work with. It resists re-traumatization, and it helps people rebuild that sense of control and empowerment. We always want to try to empower our survivors as much as possible. We want to make sure that we're basing that in cultural humility and equity. really looking at where the person is coming from and knowing that they know themselves best. We are not out to save people. That's not healthy and it's not good for folks. They've already had so many of their choices taken away from them and their control. So we want to make sure that as much as possible that we help them rebuild that sense of control and empowerment. So that may be watching them make some really hard choices that maybe we don't agree with all the time, but we're still going to support that survivor and make sure that we're being supportive, empathetic, and compassionate. It's really important that we're looking at folks from that person-centered view, and that we're not, that we're remembering those intersectionalities, and that most of the time they're dealing with so many different things. And if we're not being supportive and compassionate, they're going to be stuck in that place.
I think it's important to remember too, not to just focus on that the trauma might be from, like you said earlier, one experience. This is probably multiple things over time that have built up. It can be from one experience, but I would say a lot of the people that we have contact with, they've had a lot of different things go on in their life that have led up to where they are at the point where we're involved.
Yeah, I would agree with that, especially when we have folks coming in and perhaps they're just coming in because they feel like they're leaving an abusive partner. But then while they're talking to us, they discover, oh, I've also been financially abused. I've also have that isolation. They were gaslighting me. Oh, dang, I was sexually assaulted and didn't even realize it was sexual assault. Like, so now they're trying to piece together all these other victimizations, and it's, they have all these other things to deal with now that they didn't even realize were necessarily connected. They thought they were coming in for this one experience maybe, but realizing that they have this whole history of trauma and vulnerability.
And we are always trying to grow and learn and find out ways to better interact with people suffering crisis and going through traumatic experiences. We're humans and we don't always do it right, but we're trying to learn and grow and be the best we can to offer people in need the services they need.
I would say, and I really appreciate the relationship that us advocates have with, especially the Menomonie Police Department, because we have got to see that that grow in you all. Like when we have officers come here and ask us, like, how can we be better trauma informed, and like how can we work with survivors better? Like that's amazing to me that they want to learn and grow, and it really shows when when we have survivors telling us about, we had a really good experience with this officer and this officer and this officer. And I know that those are the folks that put in that extra work and really want to make sure that they're being there for those survivors. And it really does show with them.
So we hope you found this informative, talking about kind of mental health and all the aspects that impacts our agencies for Mental Health Awareness Month. I want to remind you that, as always, we'll link resources at the end and in the description of this video. And thank you again for joining us.